Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, so when you think of a clown today, your mind probably goes straight to a guy with a bright red ball on his nose, oversized shoes, trying to make a bunch of kids laugh at a birthday party, right? Well, today we're going to completely subvert that modern perception. We're diving into some incredibly fascinating source material to uncover the true historical function of the clown. As you'll see, the clown is actually deeply connected to how human society operates, and more importantly, how we process painful truths and, honestly, existential dread.
So think about this for a second. Why did history's most ruthless tyrants trust a man in ridiculous clothes way more than their own top generals? Throughout history, rulers were constantly facing massive societal nightmares, famines, wars, extreme poverty. If you or I brought up these painful realities to a king, we could easily lose our heads, literally. But the clown? They could make a joke about that exact same misery, make the ruler laugh, and just walk away completely unharmed. This wasn't just entertainment, folks. It was a highly specific survival mechanism for dealing with society's worst nightmares. Okay, let's dive into this. What is the psychological secret here? According to the dynamics outlined in our sources, when a person acts completely ridiculous, their perceived social value absolutely plummets. In the eyes of power, they become, well, worthless. And that is exactly where their superpower lies. By totally lowering their own dignity, they eliminate their threat level. The weight of their words is reduced just enough that they can say pretty much anything. Their complete lack of prestige creates this invisible shield, allowing them to speak incredibly dangerous truths to absolute power without facing the executioner. And to see just how deeply ingrained this is in the human condition, we really just have to look at the timeline. This isn't just some localized one-off trend. It is a universal phenomenon. We see it in ancient China with a figure named Qiantong. We see it in 1514 in Poland with the legendary Stańczyk. We see it all throughout the Middle Ages in royal courts all over the world, where they acted as confidants to tyrants. And, as we'll see a bit later in this explainer, we'll look at how this exact same psychological utility took a very dark twist in Chicago in the 1970s. Let's start in ancient China with Qiantong. So the story goes that one of the emperor's dogs was actually attacking people. Qiantong spoke up to defend the citizens, basically telling the emperor he needed to control his children. Well, the emperor was extremely insulted by the implication that he was the father of a dog. So insulted, in fact, he grabbed his bow and shot an arrow right at the clown. Luckily, the arrow missed. Now, a normal person would immediately drop to their knees and beg for their life. Not Qiantong. He turned to the crowd and cheerfully yelled out, "Thank God the king's arrow didn't reach me, but my joke did." The emperor just burst out laughing, called him a madman, and let him live. Humor was quite literally his ultimate defense. Fast forward a bit to Poland in 1514. This brings us to Stańczyk. Now, he wasn't just a clown. He was a brilliant philosopher and social critic who actually served 3 different Polish kings. In 1514, Poland suffered a massive, devastating blow. They lost the crucial city of Smolensk to the Russians. It was an absolute crisis. But while the Russians were taking the city, Queen Bona Sforza was throwing a lavish party. There's this incredibly famous painting capturing this exact moment. In the background, the elite are drinking, feasting, and having a great time. But in the foreground sits Stańczyk, the clown, slumped in a chair, utterly depressed over a letter bringing the horrible news of Smolensk. The contrast is just staggering. Around this time, Stańczyk had actually been beaten up and had his clothes torn by some street kids. When he got back to the palace, the king saw him and laughed at his pathetic, ragged state. Stańczyk fired back with this legendary quote. He said, "You laugh at my torn clothes, but they tore away Smolensk and you are silent." It's incredible, right? He fearlessly weaponized his pathetic comedic status to deliver a brutal political reality check directly to the king's face. Literally anyone else would have been executed for treason on the spot. But for the clown? Just another day at work. To really understand why this was tolerated, we have to look at the environment of a royal court in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. These places were incredibly toxic. The rulers were widely feared by the public, sure, but internally, they were completely surrounded by sycophants and yes-men who only wanted power or favor. Because of this, kings lived in a state of intense paranoia and isolation. They just couldn't trust their own advisors. They desperately needed a genuine confidant, someone they could talk to as an equal without constantly looking over their shoulder fearing a political assassination. And this brilliantly illustrates why clowns basically functioned as royal therapists. Take Takak from 11th century Iran. There were these highly dangerous rumors going around that the sultan's wife was unfaithful, and worse, that the sultan knew about it and allowed it. While resting on the clown's lap, the Sultan asked what his relationship was to a notorious local pimp. Talcott calmly replied that he was just the cushion. Just brilliant. Now, jumping over to the court of the Caliph, we see a similar dynamic with the clown Abu Nuwas. He was actually caught drinking wine near a holy site by the Caliph himself. Abu Nuwas tried to claim it was just milk. When the Caliph demanded to know why the milk was red, the clown didn't miss a beat. He replied that the milk had simply blushed red from the embarrassment of looking at the mighty ruler. It was this incredibly quick wit that safely navigated a highly dangerous royal temper. Now, perhaps the starkest example of this entire dynamic is in the court of King Henry VIII. Henry was, well, notorious. He executed tens of thousands of people, including his own wives. If you were one of the king's ministers, your life was defined by constant paranoia, a chaotic, extremely high turnover rate, and a very real chance of being executed. Now compare that terrifying reality to his personal clown, Will Sommers. Sommers enjoyed unprecedented psychological stability. He was calm, grounded, and get this, he was the only person allowed to walk into the king's private rooms completely unannounced. He not only survived Henry's reign of terror, he actually outlived him and went on to serve his children.
Sommers used this unique access brilliantly. During a period of severe economic crisis, poverty, and hunger across the kingdom, Sommers went to Henry. Henry, being Henry, started boasting about his immense power, his ministers, his massive army, his accountants. Sommers just looked at him and delivered the blunt truth, totally deadpan. You have many ministers, a large army, and accountants, but they all steal from you. Sommers highlighted a massive, critical issue of corruption that absolutely no general or minister would ever dare confess to the king.
But this whole setup brings up a really profound philosophical question posed by our sources. Was the clown truly free? I mean, sure, they had physical freedom and the ultimate freedom of speech, but they essentially lived in a golden cage. Their survival was strictly conditional. The exact moment they stopped being funny, they were in massive danger. They traded their absolute dignity for their lives. They were protected from death as long as they were useful, but the cost was accepting complete, utter social marginalization. They had no true respect, only a functional, somewhat desperate utility.
Okay, now we need to make a major tonal shift in this explainer. We've seen the historical utility of clowns, how they bypassed social barriers to speak truth to power, but as time marched on, the role of the clown changed. And in Chicago, in the 1970s, that exact same psychological utility, that invisible shield of harmlessness we've been talking about, was weaponized in one of the most horrifying ways imaginable.
This brings us to John Wayne Gacy. On the surface, Gacy was a completely normal, respected construction worker and a highly active community member. However, his background was deeply troubled. He suffered a highly abusive childhood at the hands of his father and sustained severe head trauma at the age of 11. In 1968, he was actually arrested and served time for sexually assaulting a young boy. But after his release, he created an alter ego for himself to perform at local parties. He called himself Pogo the Clown.
So the crucial point here is, why did a man with Gacy's dangerous predilections specifically choose to dress as a clown? Well, the source material suggests it was absolutely not an accident. Gacy realized that a clown costume provides a literal social license to bypass normal boundaries. Think about it. As a clown, you are expected to act strange. You can approach children, smile, play with them, and it raises zero suspicion because, quote-unquote, that's just what a clown does. He took that historical immunity of the fool and deliberately weaponized it to hide right in plain sight. From 1972 to 1978, Gacy used the innate trust and social immunity associated with his clown persona to commit unspeakable atrocities. He would lure young men with the promise of magic tricks, or he'd offer them money and jobs working with his construction company. Once he gained their trust and got them back to his house, he would murder them, ultimately burying their bodies beneath his own floorboards before he was finally captured by authorities in 1978. When investigators finally searched his home, the truly grim reality was uncovered. Authorities found the remains of his victims. It is estimated that he murdered at least 33 young men. 33. It's a stark, chilling reminder of what happens when the social immunity of the clown, a mechanism that was originally designed to relieve societal pain, is manipulated and twisted to inflict it instead. Now, this horrific reality forces us to ask a really difficult question. Why do we laugh at dark things? When a comedian makes a joke about something deeply painful, what we call black comedy, why is our immediate reaction to laugh?
Psychologists categorize this as a defense mechanism. It's an unconscious strategy our brains use to cope with a reality that is simply way too much to process. When the human mind encounters something it just can't accept, but also cannot change, it lessens the emotional suffering by forcing out a laugh.
Philosophers and psychologists have debated exactly why we laugh for centuries. Superiority theory argues that we laugh when we feel morally or intellectually above someone else. Incongruity theory points to a sharp clash between expectation and reality when something just doesn't fit. But perhaps the deepest is tension release. Laughter is literally a biological venting mechanism. When you laugh, you burn energy, you release physical tension, and your body is flooded with endorphins. In a cruel world filled with hunger, war, and death, laughter isn't just fun, it's a necessary biological survival tool. Now, what's really interesting about this next point is how the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche thought about this biological reflex. He didn't just see it as a weird human quirk. He viewed laughing at the absurdity of existence as a profound display of strength. To him, it's a way of looking at the utter senselessness and pain of life and saying, I see the game and I refuse to surrender to it. Laughing is a powerful way of taking your power back from an uncaring universe. And really, this is exactly why the clown is such a perfect mirror for the paradox of humanity. The clown completely embodies our unique capacity to create profound joy, to heal trauma, and to speak truth to absolute power. But as we saw with the terrible tragedies in Chicago, the mask of the clown also represents our capacity for terrible darkness and deception. It shows that we are creatures capable of both immense, beautiful light and devastating cruelty.
So I want you to reflect on this for a moment based on everything we've looked at today. Have you ever found yourself laughing right in the face of pain, embarrassment, or danger? Have you ever used a joke as a shield when you were actually really hurting inside? It's a defense mechanism as old as civilization itself, and we all do it.
Which leaves us with one final, provocative question to consider. If lowering our status, making jokes to survive, and wearing a mask to navigate a harsh world are truly universal human traits, are we all clowns? Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and I'll leave you to think on that.